Welcome back to Monster Tamer, a 2D Pokemon-like RPG created Phaser 3. Previously, we took a look at how we could use the Tweakpane library to go ahead and create simple GUIs that we can use while developing our game. And so we saw how we could have some two-way binding between our GUI and our game objects in our scene. So then that way we can go ahead and update our game objects based on our interactive GUI here. If you missed the previous videos, there'll be links in the video description to the source code up to this point, as well as complete source code for this video. There'll also be a link to the previous videos if you'd like to catch up. So let's get started. Alright, so now that we've created our basic GUI with Tweakpane, the next thing we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and review our draggable code that we added when we first created our test scene here. And so currently our scene is set up to have our enemy game object to be draggable. And what this will do is it's going to go ahead and move our game object in our scene based on our mouse events. And when this game object is updated, it's also binding to our data in Tweakpane. So then that way in our GUI, we can see our object's X and Y position. And we previously made this read only. So then that way we can drag our event and we can see just the data update in our GUI here. And so this is really helpful because when we want to position game objects in our scene, we normally have to provide our X and Y values. And sometimes we might just want to tweak those values. And with our current process, we have to do a hot reload and we have to wait for our scene to refresh just to go ahead and move our game object a little bit. Where if we have something like this tool here, this functionality, we can go ahead and just drag our game object and position where we want to be. And then we have our values right here displayed. So then that way we can go ahead and just copy those and then use them in our game. All right, so what we're going to go ahead and do now is we're going to come back to our code and we're going to do a deeper dive into our code for making our game objects draggable. So currently in our create method in our test scene, after we create our phaser image game object, we're calling a new function called make draggable. And we're basically providing just our game object to that function. And so what we're going to do is when we first created our template for our test scene, we added this draggable.js file. And at a high level, this file just has one exported function called make draggable. And basically what this function does is it takes our game object and it allows us to make it interactive so we can interact with it. And then we use the built-in events of Phaser 3 to go ahead and interact with our game object. All right, so previously we've worked with a variety of events in our Phaser 3 game, and we've seen how we can use the keyboard events to listen for input on various keys. We've seen how we can use scene events to go ahead and create nice transitions for when a scene starts and stops. And so the Phaser 3 framework is very powerful, and there's a variety of events we can listen to. These can be as granular down to our game object level, and they can be tied to our input, such as our mouse. And so with a combination of these events, what we can do is we can listen for events on our game object and when the player interacts with our game objects themselves. And so to make all this function, what you have to do with your game objects is you have to make them interactive. And what this will do is when you call the setInteractive method, Phaser is going to pass this game object to your input manager and it enables it for input. And by default, if you don't call this method, you can't actually interact with your game objects. So typically what you would see with the setInteractive is like if you have a button and you want to click it in your GUI. So instead of our menus where you have to use keyboards to navigate, you could have a button or a game object that you listen for a click on, and then that could be a trigger to do something. So to have that functionality, you actually have to call this method, so then that way you can listen for those events. And so after you call setInteractive, what you can then do is listen for various input events on your game object or even on your scene, and then go ahead and react to those events. And so when you listen to these events on your Phaser 3 scene, you're going to get a target of what game object was interacted with. But because our base game object class also extends our same event emitter, we can listen for events at the game object level. And then that way we can have our game object react. All right, so what we're going to go ahead and do is first we're going to take a look at some of the events we're listening to and walk through what those events are. And then we're going to go ahead and come back and walk through the code and how it all functions. And so the first event we're going to take a look at is our game object's event destroy event. And so the destroy event, this is fired in Phaser anytime a game object is going to be destroyed or cleaned up. And you can go ahead and listen to this event to do any type of additional cleanup that you want on your game objects. But you could also do it to do other business logic. So for example, if we're making like a space arcade shooter like Asteroids or Space Invaders, What we could do is when a game object is destroyed, we could increment our score in our game. What we're going to go ahead and do in our code is we're going to listen for this event, and when it's invoked, we're going to clean up all the other event listeners on our game object, so then that way they are cleaned up properly. All right, and so then our other events are tied to our input with our mouse, and so we have the pointer down, pointer up, and pointer move events. And basically what these events are is when your mouse interacts with your game object or your scene, you can listen for these events to get details about what your mouse is doing currently. And so your pointer down and pointer up, basically that's when you click down on your mouse and then you click up. So when you click down, the pointer down event will be fired. When you release that, the pointer up will be fired. And so typically these events are really useful for if you have things like buttons or you want to click on a game object. So you can imagine your game, if you had a button to start your game, you could click on it. Or even if you had game objects that like a balloon pop where you want to click a bubble or a balloon to pop it, you could do that and it would destroy your game object. And so by listening for these events, when our game object's interactable, we can go ahead and listen for those. The other one is the pointer move event. And basically what that event does is when your mouse moves, it's going to fire this event with details of where your mouse is currently located, your cursor. And so with this event, because we have the details of where our mouse is at, what we can do is we can use that to update our game object positioning to move it where the mouse is currently located. So at a high level, those are the 4 events that we're listening for in our code and what they do. And so what we're going to go ahead and do is our make draggable function allows us to enable logs, and by default it's disabled. What we're going to do is we'll come back to our test scene and we're going to go ahead and pass true for our second argument. Then what we'll do is let's come to our scene, and what we should see now is when we interact with our scene, we should see some console log statements appear in our console. And so if you don't see them, one thing to note is we're using the debug level for our console log. So what you'll want to do is change your level to make sure verbose is enabled. If it's not, you're not going to see anything in your console, but you should see some hidden events here. So we're going to try on verbose so we can see what's happening. And so what I'm going to go ahead and do is let's go ahead and clear our console. And so when we click down on our game object, we'll see right away our start drag functions invoked. And so what's happening is we are immediately listening for that pointer down event. We're calling that start drag function. And so when we click down with our mouse, that goes ahead and fires that event for that pointer down event. When we release it, that fires our second event, which is the pointer up. And so right now in our code, that's tied to our stop drag function. Finally, for our last event, if we start moving our game object around by clicking and holding our mouse, we can see that the on drag function is being invoked, and that's tied to our pointer move event. Because every time our pointer moves just a little bit, this event will be fired. All right, so now we reviewed the events and we can see how they function in our game. We're going to go ahead and walk through our code real quick so we can see how this make draggable functionality works. And so what we do is in our function, the first thing we do is we call the setInteractive method on our game object. And this is going to make it so we can actually interact with our game objects. Then we define some functions that are within the scope of this function. So then that way they're just private and they're not exposed internally. The reason we did this is just to keep everything within this code tied to the specific game object. And so then that way we don't have to pass around the reference of this and that game object. Instead, we can just reference that game object that's passed into the make draggable function. So then with those functions, what we do is with our event listeners, we just provide that as our callback. And so the first one we do is with destroy. And basically with our destroy function, all we're doing is we're removing all of the event listeners, we're turning them off for our pointer down, pointer move, and pointer up events. Because this event is used with once, we're only going to fire this event listener one time and then it gets cleaned up. Versus our other ones, we're using the on method, which means they're going to stay on until we manually turn them off. All right, so the first one, what we do is we listen for the pointer down event. And when that happens, we call this start drag function. And so in this start drag callback function, basically what we do is we're going to go ahead and turn off our event listener for the start drag. And then that way we're no longer listening for that one event, but now we're going to listen for 2 other events. We're going to turn on our pointer move and pointer up. And with those event listeners, we're going to go ahead and call two additional functions. One of them is stop drag and one of them is on drag. Stop drag, basically we just do the inverse of what we do on start drag. What we do is we go ahead and we turn on our start drag listener again, and then we go ahead and turn off our on drag and stop drag. And by doing that, that allows us to know when our mouse movement is complete when we click and release. And then that way, we're only listening for on drag when we're actually holding our mouse down, and then that's why we can click and drag our game object. One other thing we are doing is we are rounding the position for our game objects, because on our drag, when we get our pointer event, this is going to be the full floating point number, and we want to go ahead and round that to a nice integer so we can keep our game objects positioned at a nice even integer. All right, and so then our last function is this on drag function. And basically this on drag function, this callback, is going to receive our phaser endpoint pointer, which is our pointer game object, which will have our X and Y values of our cursor and where it's currently located in our game. And so with that, what we can do is we can grab the X and Y values from that pointer and assign that to our game object. And then that's what allows us to move this game object around in our scene. All right, and so as you can see, by using those built-in events of phaser, we can create this really nice draggable effect just by listening to those events and updating our game object. And so with this new utility function, you can easily add it to your game objects in your game, and you can make them draggable. And then for our purposes, it allows us to position our game objects, and then we can check the position without having to manually do it through our code multiple times. All right, with that actually brings it into our video. And so with that actually wraps up our tools part 1 section. And what we're going to do is we're going to pause working on our test scene, and we're going to switch back to adding functionality to our game. And so next what we're going to do is we're going to focus on adding in a game menu to allow us to save our game from our world scene. And what we'll do is we're going to go ahead and persist our player data. And then that way, when we do the continue option, we can pick right back up where we left off. So as a reminder, there's a link in the description of this video to the complete source code for this video. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. If you did enjoy the video, please consider liking the video and hitting the bell icon to be notified when the next video in this series is released. For more great Phaser 3 content, please see the links on your screen now.